The Veth-Sorath Convocation was, by the standards of galactic diplomacy, a mid-tier event. Not the Grand Assembly, which convened once a decade and required 18 months of preparatory negotiations simply to agree on the table shape. Not the Emergency Compact, which gathered only when something was already catastrophically wrong. The Veth-Sorath Convocation was, in the formal language of the Interstellar Council's event classification system, a Tier 2 regional summit, significant enough to draw senior diplomatic representation from 43 civilizations, not significant enough to require the personal attendance of heads of state. It was, in the informal language of the people who actually organize such things, the kind of summit where the real decisions had already been made, and the 3 days of formal session existed primarily to give the decisions the appearance of having been arrived at collectively. The agenda had 7 items. 6 of them were procedural ratifications of agreements negotiated in the preceding 6 months by the delegation's respective trade and border management staffs. The 7th was a resource allocation dispute in the outer Ellari corridor that had been simmering for 11 years and which was on the agenda for the 4th consecutive convocation, meaning that its presence was less a sign of progress than of institutional habit. 43 delegations, 3 days, a predetermined conclusion for 6 of 7 agenda items and an 11th-year stalemate on the 7th. The Protocol Secretariat had been organizing events of this type for 60 years. They understood the form. They understood the hierarchy. They understood, with the practiced precision of people whose entire professional value resided in their understanding of such things, exactly which details communicated what to whom and why. The seating arrangements communicated everything. At the Veth-Sorath Convocation, as at all council-tier diplomatic summits, seating was allocated by a formula that combined membership seniority, current territorial holdings, economic weight, and what the Secretariat's internal documentation called legacy standing. A metric that in practice meant how long a civilization had been important and how loudly they were willing to assert it. The result, as it always was a room arranged around a center of gravity. The Praetori sovereign delegation held the primary position at the main table, a chair of significant physical scale, positioned at the table's acknowledged head, with direct sightlines to every other delegation and the Secretariat's presentation systems. Their chair was, by the specification sheet that Protocol Officer Thalammon had personally reviewed and signed off on, constructed from a material that the Praetori considered symbolically significant, and that had been sourced, at considerable logistical effort, from the Praetori homeworld specifically for the occasion. The Varun Mercantile Communion sat to the Praetori's left. Their chair was slightly lower, 3 centimeters precisely and slightly narrower, enough to communicate the differential, not enough to constitute an insult. This continued around the table. 43 delegations, 43 chairs, each one calibrated to within a centimeter, and a symbolic reference of its designated occupant's exact position in the hierarchy that the convocation existed to reinforce. The human delegation's chair was the last to be specified. The humans had been added to the convocation's participant list 6 weeks before the event, at the specific request of the ellari communion, who had argued that the outer corridor resource dispute, Agenda Item 7, the 11-year stalemate, had a human territorial component that made their presence procedurally appropriate. The Praetori delegation had objected. The Varun had been neutral. The remaining delegations had deferred to the Praetori. The ellari had persisted, citing 3 separate charter provisions. The compromise reached, as compromises in such settings usually are at the moment when the cost of continued argument exceeded the cost of conceding, was that the humans would be admitted as observer participants, present, acknowledged, permitted to speak if recognized by the chair. Not seated at the main table. Seated at the secondary table. The one along the near wall, where observer participants and junior secretariat staff sat, and where the acoustic configuration of the room meant that speech from that position carried to perhaps a third of the chamber with any reliability. The chair assigned to the human delegation's position at the secondary table was, as Protocol Officer Thalammon would later describe in his account, a chair that had been in the Secretariat's storage inventory for approximately 40 years. It had been used, at various points in those 40 years, as an auxiliary seat for overflow Secretariat staff during large sessions and on. Occasion, as an elevated platform for a technician performing a ceiling fixture repair. It was not a small chair in the literal sense of being physically inadequate for human dimensions. The humans were, by galactic standards, a medium-sized biomorph, and the chair would accommodate them without difficulty. It was a small chair in every other sense that mattered. Thalammon, reviewing the final seating specification the evening before the convocation opened, made a note in his personal log. The note read, "I have been doing this for 22 years. I know what the chair assignment communicates. I am uncomfortable with it. I am not, however, authorized to override the Praetori delegation's preference on seating for observer participants, and I have been told clearly and twice that my role is to implement the arrangements, not evaluate them." Well, he filed the specification. He went home. He did not sleep well. The following morning, the human delegation arrived. The human delegation comprised 3 individuals. I had reviewed their biographical records in preparation, as I review all delegation records. The lead delegate was Ambassador Nadia Osei, 51 years old, 23 years in the diplomatic service. Previous postings included 3 Tier 1 summits, the ellari bilateral trade renegotiation of Cycle 4907, which had been considered a near impossible task, and which she had resolved in 9 days, and the Keth-Narwhal border mediation of Cycle 4911, which had required 11 months, and had produced an agreement that both sides described in their respective public statements as better than they had expected to achieve. Her 2 colleagues were a junior diplomatic attaché and a technical advisor, standard complement for a delegation of their tier. They arrived at the Convocation Center at 8:40, 20 minutes before the opening session. I met them at the entrance, as I meet all delegations, to escort them to their seats and address any preliminary questions. Ambassador Osei shook my hand, a human greeting custom I was prepared for, and said good morning and asked my name. As I told her, she said, "Thank you for meeting us, Thalammon. I have a few questions about the room before we go in if you have a moment." I said I had a moment. She asked about the acoustic configuration. Specifically, she asked where the room's sound dispersion was strongest and weakest. She framed this as a practical question. She said she had a mild hearing issue in her left ear and liked to orient herself before sessions so she could position herself to compensate. I told her the acoustic map. The center of the main table was the strongest position. The secondary table along the near wall was, I acknowledged, not optimal. She thanked me and asked if the Secretariat's presentation system had a mobile audio component, a personal speaker or relay that could be placed near any position in the room to equalize acoustic distribution. I said yes, we had such equipment, though it was not normally used for observer participant positions. She said, I wonder if we could make an exception for the hearing issue. I said I would look into it. She said, also, and I apologize for the specificity here, I noticed on the room specification that the secondary table is positioned with the delegates facing the main table's back third. Is there a version of the configuration where the secondary table faces the main table's full length instead? Just for line of sight, since I'll be working from written materials and want to be able to see the main proceedings clearly. The secondary table was, indeed, positioned at an angle that put the observer participant seats facing the back third of the main table rather than its center. This was standard placement for the secondary table. It had never, in 22 years of my service, been questioned. I said I would need to check whether moving it was feasible given the room's fixed elements. She said, "I don't want to cause trouble. If it's not feasible, please don't worry about it." She smiled, she thanked me again and moved toward the chamber entrance. I stood for a moment. She had not asked for a better chair. She had not complained about the observer participant designation. She had asked for an acoustic relay for a hearing condition and a slight table repositioning for line of sight. Both requests were reasonable. Both had legitimate stated grounds. Neither required the Secretariat to make any statement about her delegation's status or the protocol hierarchy. And if I complied with both, which I realized, going to do because the requests were reasonable, and because I had the authority to make minor room adjustments, and because I had not slept well last night and I knew why. The result would be a human delegation with clear sightlines to the full main table and audio equipment that would carry their voice to every position in the room. Not a better chair. A better room. I went to find the acoustic equipment. Chair DUUVSERATH, the convocation will come to order. I welcome all delegations to the Veth-Sorath Regional Summit. We have 3 days and 7 agenda items. I remind delegations that observer participants are present in an advisory capacity and may speak only when recognized by the chair. The chair will prioritize recognition for full member delegations in the interest of session efficiency. We will begin with a review of the session schedule. The Secretariat will distribute Ambassador Nadia Osei from secondary table position, carrying clearly through the acoustic relay. Chair Veth-Sorath, I apologize for the interruption at the outset. I would like to request a brief point of order before we begin. Chair DUUVSERATH, the chair has not recognized the observer participant delegation. Ambassador Osei, I understand. I am asking for recognition for a point of order, which under Convocation Procedural Rule 14b may be raised before the formal session agenda commences by any participant, including observer participants, on matters affecting the session's procedural integrity. Note from ellari, there was a pause here of approximately 4 seconds. I watched Veth-Sorath's aide check something on his reference panel. Rule 14b does in fact say exactly what she quoted. Chair DUUVSERATH, the chair recognizes the point of order. Please be brief. Ambassador Osei, thank you. My point of order concerns Agenda Item 7, the Outer Ellari Corridor Resource Allocation Dispute. The human territorial component of this dispute involves 3 systems that are under active human-civilian habitation. Under Compact Charter Provision 7c, any resolution of a territorial dispute that includes actively inhabited human territory requires the consent of the human signatory government to be binding. I raise this because the session schedule as distributed lists Agenda Item 7 for a final resolution vote on Day 3. I want to ensure the room understands that any resolution passed on Day 3 without human signatory consent will not be binding on the human territorial component. This is not a threat. It is a procedural clarification. I raise it now so that the 3 days of session can be organized with accurate information about what a Day 3 vote can and cannot achieve. Thank you, that is my point of order. Chair DUUVSERATH, the chair notes the point of order. The Secretariat will review the relevant charter provisions before Day 3. The session will proceed. From the personal account of Protocol Officer ellari continued. The point of order took 4 minutes and 40 seconds, including the pause. In 4 minutes and 40 seconds, Ambassador Osei had accomplished the following. She had demonstrated knowledge of the convocation's procedural rules in specific enough detail to cite the provision that allowed her to speak before being formally recognized. She had cited the Compact Charter accurately, which I confirmed, on a provision that the drafters of the session agenda had apparently not reviewed before scheduling a binding vote on Item 7 for Day 3. She had placed on the formal record in the first 15 minutes of the first session that a binding resolution on the most contentious item required her government's consent. And she had done all of this in a tone so measured and so professionally courteous that there was no surface to object to. She had not challenged the hierarchy. She had not disputed her observer-participant status. She had raised a point of order under a rule that entitled her to do so, and the rule was real and the point was valid. In the secondary table position, in the smallest chair, with audio equipment that carried her voice to every seat in the room, I watched Delegate Orath-Voon of the Praetori during the 12-second pause after her point of order. He was a senior diplomat. He had been to 47 summits of this tier or higher. His expression during those 12 seconds was the expression of someone recalculating. He was, I believe, asking himself the same question I was asking myself. How had we not checked Provision 7C before putting Item 7 on the Day 3 schedule? The answer, of course, was that we had assumed Item 7 would proceed the way it had at the previous 3 convocations, with the human territorial component treated as a secondary consideration, with the human delegation either absent or present in a capacity too limited to affect the outcome. We had not checked 7C because we had not considered that the human delegation might know it existed. The session proceeded. She did not speak again in Session 1. She did not need to. Ministry. Brief update on the Veth-Sorath situation. The human delegation raised a point of order in the first 15 minutes. It was valid. I have had my staff review Provision 7C, and she is correct the Day 3 Bindi. NG vote on Item 7 will not achieve what we planned it to achieve without human government consent. This is a significant change to our timeline. The human ambassador is Nadia Osei. I have pulled her file. She has a reputation. I had not read the file before today because the human delegation was listed as observer participant, and I had not considered them a significant factor. I am reading the file now. My initial assessment of the next 2.5 days has changed substantially. I will transmit a revised strategic summary by end of today. Orath-Voon. During the midday recess between Sessions 1 and 2, I observed Ambassador Osei in the convocation's common area. She was not holding court. She was not working the room with the practiced energy of a delegate who understands that recess periods are where the real negotiation happens. She was sitting at a small table near the window with a cup of the beverage her delegation had brought, coffee, which I had encountered before at events with human participants, and which has a distinctive smell that a significant portion of the galaxy finds either appealing or alerting, and she was reading. Not a prepared brief, a physical document. She turned pages. I approached and asked whether she needed anything. She looked up and said she was fine and thanked me. Then she said, "Thalaman, thank you for the acoustic equipment, and for moving the table. It made a real difference." I said it was no trouble. She said, "I know it was some trouble. I appreciate that you did it." She went back to her reading. I noted, because it is my job to note such things, that over the following 40 minutes of the recess period, 4 other delegations approached her table. Not because she invited them, because they came. The ellari communion's deputy delegate came first. He sat down and they talked for about 12 minutes. He had his own coffee. I don't know where he got it, but I believe she gave it to him. The Munathi delegation's lead came next. Shorter conversation, 6 minutes, but the Munathi delegate was someone I had observed across 12 summits and who I had never seen initiate a conversation with a delegation they had not previously met. He initiated this one. The Thunvel Compact's junior delegate, the most junior person in the room, representing the smallest civilization present, came and sat down without saying anything for a moment, looking slightly uncertain. Ambassador Osei looked up from her document and said something to her that I was not close enough to hear. The Thunvel delegate laughed. They talked for 20 minutes. And the fourth, Delegate Sarath Moon of the Gel Hierarchate, who is by professional reputation the most careful and least approachable senior diplomat in this tier of council events, and who has, in my experience, never voluntarily initiated a conversation at a mid-tier summit recess. She sat down across from Ambassador Osei and said something. Ambassador Osei put down her document. They talked for the remainder of the recess. I watched this from across the common area, and I tried to identify the mechanism. What was it that brought four separate delegations, each with different agendas, different interests, different positions on every item in the session, to a table in the corner where a woman was reading? I watched for 20 minutes, and I think I found part of the answer. She was not performing. Every other delegate in that common area during that recess period was performing in some way, performing authority, performing confidence, performing the relaxed ease of someone who is not concerned about the proceedings because the proceedings are going their way. The common area at a diplomatic summit is a stage and everyone on it is acting, and the acting is skilled and professional and completely visible if you have spent 22 years watching it. She was reading. When people approached her, she looked up from the reading without transition, fully present immediately, without the social recalibration that most people perform when interrupted. She was not managing the interaction. She was just in it. And she was listening. I have seen a great many diplomats listen. Diplomatic listening is a trained skill. It has a specific quality, attentive, focused, calibrated to signal that the listener is engaged while simultaneously processing what the engagement means for their own position. What she was doing was different. She was not processing in parallel, she was just listening. The Gel delegate, Sarath Moon, who is not given to displays of feeling, said something in the final minutes of their conversation that I was close enough to hear partially. She said, I have been at 4 of these convocations. You are the first. I missed the second half of the sentence, but I saw Sarath Moon's expression when she said it. The expression of someone who has just said something true that they do not intend to say out loud. The afternoon session covered agenda items 1 through 3, the procedural ratifications. All 3 passed as expected by large majority without significant debate. Ambassador Osei did not speak during session 2. She took notes. I was watching her from my position at the Secretariat's side station. She wrote continuously. Not notes on the proceedings were straightforward and contained nothing she would have needed to record. She was writing something else. The pages filled and she turned them. Her attaché passed her additional paper twice. At the close of session 2, when the room was clearing, Delegate Orath Voon of the Praetori paused at the secondary table on his way to the exit. He said to Ambassador Osei, a word ambassador. She said, of course. They spoke for approximately 4 minutes. I was processing Secretariat materials at the side station and could hear intermittently. I heard Orath Voon say, the point of order this morning was accurate. I heard Ambassador Osei say, I know. I heard Orath Voon say something about the timeline for item 7. I heard Ambassador Osei say, I'm not trying to block a resolution. I'm trying to make sure the resolution that passes is one that can be implemented. A resolution that requires human consent to be binding, passed without human consent, doesn't resolve anything. It adds a new dispute on top of the existing one. I heard Orath say, what would a resolution with human consent require? I heard Ambassador Osei say, a conversation I haven't been invited to have yet. Orath was quiet for a moment. Then he said, have dinner with my delegation tonight. She said I'd be glad to. She paused. May I bring Sarath Moon? Another pause. Orath said the gel. She said she has an interest in item 7 that I think intersects with yours in a useful way. I'd rather find that out at dinner than at the table tomorrow. A long pause. He said fine. He left. I finished my secretariat materials. I noted in my log that in the 18 hours since Ambassador Osei had arrived at the convocation, she had established the procedural ground for human consent being required on item 7, had 4 separate senior delegates come to her during recess, had a private conversation with the Praetori lead delegate, and arranged a dinner that would include the 2 delegations with the deepest opposition on item 7 and the 1 delegation, her own, whose consent made the difference between a binding resolution and an expensive piece of paper. From the smallest chair at the secondary table, with audio equipment borrowed for a hearing condition, I closed my log. I thought about how I had not slept well the previous night. I thought I probably would not sleep well tonight either, but for different reasons. Private note for my own records. I need to write down what happened at dinner last night because I want to have a precise account of it while it is still clear. The dinner was 3 delegations, Praetori, Human, Gel, 8 people total. Praetori hosted in their suite. Orath was in his operational mode, professional, prepared, managing. His aide had clearly briefed him thoroughly on every possible outcome. Ambassador Osei arrived with her attaché and brought coffee. She always brings coffee. I have been told by the ellari deputy that she brought coffee to their recess conversation as well. I am beginning to understand this is not a social habit. It is something else. Coffee is warm and it smells distinctive and it occupies your hands and it gives you something to do when a conversation is difficult. She uses it to make rooms feel less formal. It works. The first 40 minutes were what I expected. Careful diplomatic positioning, everyone establishing their interests on item 7, Orath making the Praetori case for the resource allocation they had been advocating for 11 years, me making the Gel case, Osei listening. Just listening, she did not present the human position, she asked questions. She asked Orath what specifically would the Praetori do with the corridor access they were seeking, and what would be the consequence if they did not get it. He explained the supply chain implications for the Praetori's outer expansion program. She asked me, what was the Gel's actual minimum requirement in the corridor, not the negotiating position, but the floor below which the Gel would find a resolution unacceptable. I found myself answering more precisely than I had intended. She asked both of us, had either delegation ever laid out the minimum requirements side by side without the surrounding negotiating positions? We hadn't. She said, would you like to? The next 90 minutes, she did something I have not seen done in 11 years of this specific dispute, and which I am still working out how to describe. She did not mediate. She is not a formal mediator, and she did not perform that role. What she did was ask questions, specific structural questions about what each party actually required, stripped of the positions around the requirements, and then she played them back, not summarized, played back precisely in language that somehow made each party's minimum sound less like a demand and more like a reasonable operational need. She did this until the Praetori minimum and the Gel minimum were both on the table and visible at the same time, and then she said, these don't conflict. Orath said, of course they conflict. They have conflicted for 11 years. She said the positions have conflicted, the minimums don't look. She had a paper. She had drawn a diagram, a simple one, the kind you could draw in 5 minutes, mapping the corridor's resource zones and the access vectors each party actually required for their stated minimum operational needs. They didn't overlap. Orathvun looked at the diagram for a long time. I looked at it. She said, the reason this dispute has lasted 11 years is that both delegations have been negotiating from positions that are larger than what you actually need, and the positions overlap, so the negotiation has never made contact with the underlying requirements. The requirements have room. She paused. I've looked at the human component. Our minimum is the 3 inhabited systems. We are not in conflict with either of your minimums. A resolution that addresses your actual requirements and protects our inhabited systems is achievable. It's not the resolution that was going to be voted on day 3. That resolution was built on the positions, not the requirements, but it's a better resolution and it will hold. Orathvun said, you drew this before you came to dinner. Oh, she said, I drew it this afternoon, yes. He said, you have been here for 1 day. She said, the dispute has been in the record for 11 years. I read the file. The morning session covered Agenda Item 4, a border demarcation ratification, passed without discussion. During the Item 4 vote, I observed that every delegation at the main table, at some point during the 10-minute procedure, looked at the secondary table. Not at the vote, not at the chairs. At Ambassador Osei. She was reading again. Convocation Chair DUUVSERATH. We will take a brief recess before proceeding to Item 5. Sessions will resume in 40 minutes. Note from THA Elaman. During this recess, Ambassador Osei did not go to the common area. She remained at the secondary table. Within 8 minutes, 11 delegations had come to the secondary table to speak with her. I counted 11 from a room of 43. She spoke to each of them. She did not stand. She did not move to the main table. She received them at the secondary table in the smallest chair, and she spoke with each of them, and she listened. Session 4, the afternoon of Day 2, was when I understood that the convocation I had prepared for was not the one I was attending. The convocation I had prepared for was a 3-day process in which 6 agenda items were ratified as planned, and Item 7 produced another deferred resolution. And 43 delegations went home in the same positions they had arrived in, and we filed the session record and began planning the next convocation. The convocation I was attending was something else. It had shifted during the dinner I had not been at. It had continued to shift during the morning recess I had observed from the side station. And in Session 4, it shifted visibly, in the formal record, in front of every delegation in the room. Agenda Item 5 was a transit rights agreement. Standard. 2 parties, 1 renewal, no expected complications. The chair called Item 5. The 2 relevant delegations began their presentation. Ambassador Osei raised her hand. The chair said reflexively before he could stop himself, the chair recognizes Ambassador Osei. He had not intended to say that. Observer participants are recognized only when requested, and the request is typically a formal written submission. She had simply raised her hand and he had recognized her, because by Day 2 afternoon, recognizing her had become the room's default response to her seeking the floor. She said, I apologize for the interruption. I want to raise a point that the parties may find useful before they present their transit rights renewal. The route covered by this agreement intersects with the Ellari corridor at 2 points. Any resolution on Item 7 will potentially affect transit flow at those intersection points. The parties may want to consider whether their renewal terms should include a contingency clause for Item 7 outcomes, so that they are not required to renegotiate this agreement if Item 7 moves in an unexpected direction. The 2 delegations presenting on Item 5 looked at each Each other. One of them said we had not considered that. She said the Secretariat can confirm the intersection points if you want to verify them before deciding. I confirmed them she was correct. The Item 5 presentation was paused for 22 minutes while the two delegations consulted. They returned and requested a minor amendment to their renewal terms, a contingency clause. The amendment was drafted, the item passed with the amendment. And then something happened that in 22 years of convocation secretariat service, I had never seen happen. Delegate Orath-Voon of the Prethori asked for the floor. He said, before we proceed to Item 6, the Prethori delegation wishes to make a statement regarding Item 7. The chair looked at him. He said, following consultations with the Gel Hierarchate and the human delegation, the Prethori sovereign delegation is prepared to modify its position on Item 7. We believe a framework exists for a resolution that addresses the operational requirements of the primary parties, Prethori, Gel, and human, without the territorial conflicts that have blocked agreement at the previous 3 convocations. We request that the chair allocate a working session this evening, outside the formal agenda, for the 3 primary parties to formalize this framework. The chair said the Prethori delegation is modifying its position on Item 7. Orath-Voon said the Prethori delegation is modifying its position on Item 7. I looked at the room. 43 delegations. Each one was looking either at Orath-Voon or at the secondary table. Most of them were looking at the secondary table. Ambassador Osei was writing something. She did not look up. The evening working session was scheduled. Convocation Chair DUUVSRATH. We come to Agenda Item 7, the Outer Ellari Corridor Resource Allocation. Following a working session held last evening among the primary parties, the Secretariat has received a joint framework document from the Prethori Sovereign, Gel Hierarchate, and human delegations. The document has been distributed to all delegations. The chair asks whether there are questions or objections before the vote. Delegate AMARALETH ELLARI Communion. The Ellari Communion has reviewed the joint framework. We have one question. Chair DUUVSERATH. The chair recognizes the Ellari Communion. Delegate AMARALETH. We note that the framework resolves the primary party's conflict by allocating access rights around the minimum operational requirements of each party rather than the maximum positions that have been in negotiation for 11 years. We support this approach. Our question is, this method of resolution, identifying minimums and mapping non-conflicting requirements, is this a standard technique we should be applying to other long-standing disputes, or was it specific to this corridor situation? Chair DUUVSERATH. The chair will note that the technique's applicability is a question for the relevant parties and advisors. The agenda item before us is the corridor resolution. Does the Ellari Communion have an objection to the resolution? Delegate AMARALETH. No objection. I simply want to understand what we did so we can do it again. Chair DUUVSERATH. The chair recognizes Ambassador Osei. Ambassador Osei, thank you, Chair. In response to Delegate Amaraleth's question, the technique is not specific to the corridor situation. It is a standard diagnostic tool in logistics coordination. When a conflict seems irresolvable, it is often because the parties are negotiating positions rather than requirements. Positions accumulate strategic weight over time and become difficult to move. Requirements tend to be smaller and more specific, and they often have room between them that the positions obscure. It is not a new idea. It is simply one that is sometimes forgotten in long disputes, where the positions have been held for so long that they feel like requirements. Delegate AMARALETH, thank you. Ambassador Osei, I would add, and I say this with respect to the chair and to all delegations present, that it is easier to apply when all parties are in the same room and willing to have a direct conversation. The technique requires proximity. It doesn't work through written submissions and 12-year timelines. Pause 8 seconds. Chair DUVSERATH. The chair notes the observation. The vote on the Item 7 Framework Resolution is called. Note from THILAMAN, the Praetori voted in favor. The GEL voted in favor. The human delegation voted in favor. The 43 delegations minus 1 abstention voted in favor. An Item 7 resolution, the first in 11 years, passed on Day 3 of the Veth-Sorath Convocation by 42-0 with 1 abstention. The 1 abstention was from a delegation that had not been part of any of the conversations and had apparently not read the framework document in time. Their delegate told me afterward during the closing reception that he had intended to vote in favor and had pressed the wrong indicator. The vote was effectively unanimous. The closing reception was in the convocation's main hall. 2 hours, 43 delegations plus secretariat staff. The standard end-of-summit gathering which exists to give the proceedings the human, the relational conclusion that the formal sessions don't provide. I spent most of it doing what protocol officers do at closing receptions. Managing the logistics of departure, ensuring the Secretariat's records were complete, confirming the archive schedule with my staff. In the last 30 minutes, I stood at the edge of the room and watched. Ambassador Osei was in the center of it. Not performing even now, just present, talking to people, listening to people. She had her coffee, the last of what her delegation had brought. She shared it with the Thunvel delegate who had laughed at something she said during the Day 1 recess. The Thunvel delegate was, I noticed, standing differently than she had at the convocation's opening, not less formal, more confident. The posture of someone who had been seen and taken seriously over the previous 3 days. Sarath Moon of the GEL came and stood beside me for a moment. She said, "You're watching her." I said, "It's my job to watch." She said, "You've been watching her specifically." I said, "Yes." She said, "What have you concluded?" I thought about it. I said, "I've concluded that the chair was the wrong thing to give her. Not because she deserved a better one. Because any chair you give her becomes the right chair within an hour, and the effect of giving her the smallest one was that everyone in the room was looking at the secondary table by Day 2. Sarath Moon said you gave her an acoustic relay. I said for a hearing condition. She looked at me. I said I am aware of how that sounds. She said she asked you for it. I said yes. Sarath Moon was quiet for a moment. She said, I have been a diplomat for 30 years. I have been at summits where the most important person in the room was also the most formally powerful person in the room, and I have been at summits where those were different people. I have never been at a summit where the most formally powerful person and the observer participant in the secondary table chair were so far apart in status and so close in actual effect. She paused. The Praetori modified a position they have held for 11 years, in 2 days, because she drew a diagram on a piece of paper and asked a question nobody had thought to ask. I said she read the file. Sarath Moon said she always reads the file. She moved away into the reception. I stood at the edge of the room for a few more minutes. Ambassador Osei was talking to the Munathi delegate who was laughing at something. Then she turned and saw me watching and raised her cup slightly, a small acknowledgement. As I nodded, she went back to her conversation. I thought about the seating specification I had reviewed the night before the convocation. The smallest chair, the secondary table facing the back third of the room. I thought about how I had not slept well that night. I had been uncomfortable with what the chair communicated. What I understood now, standing at the edge of the closing reception, was that the chair had not communicated what we intended. We had intended it to communicate, "You are the least important person here." What it had communicated within an hour was, "Here is where something is happening." Because something was happening there, not despite the smallest chair, not in contradiction to it, simply independent of it. The room had not given her standing. She had not needed the room to give it. She had brought it with her. In the file she had read and the questions she had prepared and the diagram she had drawn before dinner and the coffee she had brought for the room. She had walked into the smallest chair at the secondary table, and within an hour people were coming to the secondary table because that was where the work was. That is what I have been trying to find the language for across this entire account. That is the thing I want the record to say clearly. You can assign the chair, you cannot assign what happens in it. You can arrange the room, you cannot arrange what the room becomes. She arrived with the smallest chair, and she left with a resolution that 4 previous convocations had not achieved and 43 delegations that knew her name and 1 delegate from a 12-system compact who had laughed for the first time in, I was told, 3 summits. Orathvoon on his way out stopped at the Secretariat's desk where I was finalizing the archive. He said, "Thalamon, the seating arrangements for the next convocation." I said, "I'll prepare the specification." He said, "The human delegation." I said, "Observer participant sta. Thus, unless the membership classification changes." He said, "I will be submitting a formal request to the Council to review the classification before the next convocation." He paused. "I expect I will have GEL co-sponsorship." He left. I wrote it in my log. I thought about the smallest chair in the Secretariat's storage inventory. I thought we will need to find a different one for next time. Not because the status has changed yet. Because it will have. The Item 7 resolution, the first resolution of the Outer Ellari Corridor Resource Allocation dispute in 11 years, was implemented in the following administrative cycle. It has held Ambassador Nadia Osei's observer participant status was reviewed by the Council Membership Classification Committee 6 months after the convocation. The review was sponsored by the Praetori Sovereign and co-sponsored by the GEL Hierarchate. The human delegation was reclassified to full participant status at the following convocation. Their chair at the main table was, by convocation's Secretariat specification, appropriate to a mid-tier full-member delegation. Ambassador Osei, on arrival at the following convocation, looked at the chair and then looked at Protocol Officer Thalamon. She said, "It's a very good chair." Thalamon said, "We thought carefully about it." She said, "I noticed." She brought coffee for the room. She read the file. She sat down. The session began. They gave her the smallest chair and the secondary table and the acoustic equipment for a hearing condition that nobody checked was real. She arrived with a diagram she had drawn in the afternoon and coffee for whoever needed it, and 47 files that she had read completely. The room she was given was at the edge. The room she made was the center. That is not a diplomatic technique. It cannot be taught in a course or replicated from a manual. It is what happens when someone walks in not performing and not waiting, and not needing the chair to tell them who they are. She knew who she was. She just needed a room to do it in. They gave her the smallest one. She said thank you. She got to work. Written by Protocol Officer Thal Ammon in the margins of his personal log, the night after the convocation closed below it smaller. I ordered a new specification for the secondary table chairs. They will all be the same now. Not because the hierarchy is gone, because I never want to be the one who assigns the chair again and doesn't know what I'm doing.